November the 13th, 2008, and we're here in the Trillian building in the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution, and we're interviewing, as part of our Parents of the Field project, our friend and colleague Carolyn Stevenson from the University of Hawaii. Carolyn, thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for giving us your time. Now let me ask you the first question. In the Parents of the Field project, we're looking at the early days of the development of peace and conflict studies. And at the beginning, people came into the field from a whole variety of different intellectual and sort of professional backgrounds. So what was yours, and how did you enter the field? How did you come into it?
Well, I started out as a political scientist, and I had always been interested in this area, but it never occurred to me that there was a field there. So I did political science, and within that I particularly did international relations. I was doing my PhD at Ohio State, and Chad Alger came to Ohio State after I'd already been there, and was teaching participant observation research on his work at the UN. And I had always been fascinated by the UN, and the idea that that kind of qualitative research would get at a level of reality was just phenomenal to me. Now, the only problem with that was that Chad talked about doing research where he would look at the people on the floor of the UN General Assembly and then follow them into the men's room. And I thought, oh, yuck, I will never be able to do that kind of research because they're always going to be men. And I can't follow them into the men's room. Well, today that isn't the case. Today there are women, and I can follow them into the ladies' room. So I have adopted that style of research. So that was one of the things. But my interest in international cooperation, international organization was really the first part of that. Chad, by that time, was already involved in things like COPRED and the International Peace Research Association. This was the early 1970s when I first was, late night. I guess I started graduate school something like 1968, and this was 68, 72, something like that. He was already involved in COPRED and in the International Peace Research Association, but I never heard about that from him. From Chad, I got international relations and international organization with a peace flavor, but not an introduction to the field. I didn't know there was a field. I didn't know there were organizations out there, and I never knew that from Chad, even though he became my dissertation advisor. So that was really the introduction. In terms of introduction to peace research and peace studies, I went to a meeting of the International Studies Association somewhere in the Midwest. Some must have been 1977. And I was standing looking at a jobs bulletin board and looking at a flyer, and it said, Peace and World Order Studies program, Colgate University is hiring and I looked at it and I went, Peace and World Order Studies program? I didn't know there was such a thing. And this guy sitting at a table came up to me and said, are you interested in this? And I said, yes. He said, well, do you do this kind of work? I said, I didn't know there was this kind of work. I'm an international relations scholar. And so he told me about Colgate's program. It turned out this was Ted Herman, who was I guess he was director of the program at Colgate at that point. So he started talking to me, and then I found out he was a Quaker, and he found out I was a Quaker, and I instantly got interviewed at Colgate and hired at Colgate as a junior assistant professor. I think I was even a lecturer at that point. Became an assistant professor, and then knowing that I was supposed to become director of peace studies when Ted retired. But not knowing anything about the field. I didn't know there was such a thing as conflict resolution. I didn't know there was such a thing as nonviolent struggle. I knew there was a peace side of international relations, but it was straight from the international relations side. In terms of the research, Chad Alger's research was really significant on the UN and so on. But the other thing that was significant to me was Dave Singer's work. I did my master's thesis based on the Correlates of War data. And it was a quantitative study of the relationship between international organization and war and peace. So I bet you didn't know that one.
Oh, I did not.
So
You're
so
shattering
Dave,
my stereotypes.
yeah. So I got to know Dave early on through international studies meetings,
Okay.
and that was the way it began.
So you came into this field almost by accident?
Certainly by accident. I mean, absolute accident that I was standing looking at that job ad. And I don't think it was accident that Ted was standing there. I think Ted was deliberately standing there trying to figure out whether anybody interesting looked at his job ad. But absolutely by accident. And my first year at Colgate, they had to teach me that there were fields like conflict resolution and nonviolent struggle. I didn't even know that they existed. I'd never heard of anybody in those fields.
So your introduction at Colgate was to peace research, peace studies, and then there was this other thing called conflict research. Did you feel that there was a separation between the two? Were they different? Was Colgate definitely peace and not conflict?
Colgate. I was supposed to be able to teach both the introductory course in Peace and World. I think it was then called Peace and World Order Studies, and to be able to teach more specialized courses in conflict resolution and nonviolence. The basic stuff I was fine because I had a good solid international relations background with an emphasis on the peace and security stuff. But the nonviolence and the conflict resolution I had to learn. And yes, I think there was a big difference. I have always straddled the field of international relations, the field of conflict resolution, and the field of peace research. And I think they are different but overlapping and interrelated fields.
Okay.
But my work is both independently in each of those and crosses across them.
Okay. If you were to be pushed, what would you say was the major difference between the three?
International relations, I think, has been until the last 5 or 10 years or so, been at the international level. Peace research started out as that, and I think has gone across all levels. Conflict resolution, certainly in the beginning period, most of the people I worked with and knew in conflict resolution were working at the domestic level. In fact, most of them were working at the individual level.
Yeah.
I mean, when I did mediation training as a local mediator, it was all about, divorce and juvenile restitution and that kind of stuff. Conflict resolution and peace research, not conceptually, but in practical terms, in terms of the things that people that were doing were interested in, conflict resolution was much more domestic. I mean, coming out of the alternative dispute resolution area and so forth and so on. A whole variety of other things between IR and peace research. I think peace research is explicitly concerned with the value of peace. But IR was too when it started out. I mean, many, many years before. I mean, if you go back to like Wright and Richardson, I mean, they were concerned about how can you systematically use the work, the quantitative and behavioral and empirical research in political science and the other social sciences to help make peace. I mean, that went out of IR eventually, but that was the original purpose, and I think peace research took that up when IR became much more establishment-oriented. I don't know. Those are basic, sort of basic things.
Okay. So, do you think that peace studies, conflict research, peace research, do you think it has become a field?
I think it's become a field, but I'm not sure that the two are yet linked. Peace research and conflict research. I tend to think of them as peace research or peace studies and conflict resolution research, because conflict research is done in IR as well as in
Sure.
conflict studies and so on. Conflict resolution research, I think, is in many ways separate and much more technique-oriented. Conflict research is broader than that and really overlaps with peace research and overlaps with IR to some degree.
Okay.
But I don't, if you were to ask whether it were a discipline, I would say no. I mean, you at George Mason, you may be one of the only places that has a separate department in that and so on. I actually have opposed that. I know that some of the early people in the field were very much interested in it becoming a science on its own.
Okay.
I very much believe that the utility in both conflict research and peace research is that it's an interdisciplinary field.
Okay.
And it's a field that has incorporated psychology and anthropology and sociology and political science and, even physics and biology and so on. But that's its utility, and that keeping those independent strains and weaving them together and confronting one with the other is a really important part of that. So I don't want it to become a discipline, because then it's going to develop the same narrowness that each of the other disciplines developed as they came out of, physics to
Whatever.
philosophy to, and so on. So as a field, yeah, I think it's becoming a field. I mean, Kenneth Boulding, who's one of my favorite figures in the field, used to say, if you can give an exam in it, then it's a field. Okay, so I mean, I give exams in it. Okay.
Okay.
And yeah, it's definitely a field. Whether it's still two overlapping fields, I'm not sure. The people that I know in conflict resolution work, even the people at my own institution in conflict resolution research, are different from the people that I know in peace research. I mean, I go to conflict resolution meetings, and there's still people that are mostly domestically oriented.
Okay.
I go to peace research meetings, and there are people who are more internationally oriented. At my own institution, I'm the only person that crosses between the Peace Institute and the Conflict Resolution Program. Everybody else is in one or the other.
Let me push you a bit more on this discipline business, though. To the way you talk about it, it's a matter of institutionalization, and is there a department? But is there other intellectual, methodological differences between a field and a discipline that you would insist upon?
Certainly some ideological differences. Probably not methodological. I don't think there are significant methodological differences across all of the social sciences, frankly.
No.
Ideological, among peace researchers, I think that there is a positive valuation of peace that incorporates both the negative peace and positive peace kind of dimensions, that includes the notion of justice, even for those who are characterized as negative peace people. I still think that there's that emphasis on justice and on the linkages between justice and peace, and the promotion of that, and structural changes as well as cultural changes and other changes that are seen as a necessary part of the field. In other words, there's that same notion that research is going to be used to make society better. Okay? In peace research. In conflict resolution, I think there's a big division between the parts of conflict resolution. I mean, there are the ADR types who started out by wanting to make the justice system more efficient. And then the community conflict type people who wanted to make it more just and more participatory. And I think that division still exists in the field. I mean, Jim Lowy was one of the few people that sort of crossed that divide, but he brought the community justice side into that in ways that a lot of the people I know in conflict resolution today don't do. They're more interested in, let's get rid of let's not have any violence, but let's not even have any impoliteness, and don't challenge the structure of the system. I mean, a lot of the ombudsman programs that have been the practical side of this have become institutional apparatus. And I think that's a philosophical difference, it's an ideological difference, it's a difference in how the research should be used. Conceptually, no, I think there are concepts that cross across them. But even within each of the fields, I mean, within conflict research, certainly within conflict resolution research, there is a more establishment orientation than I think there is in peace research.
Okay.
Those of us who primarily identify as peace research, I think still think of ourselves as somewhat radical, even if we aren't necessarily so.
Okay. All right, so who were some influences on your own thinking, on your own development when you actually got into this field?
In the field, are you asking about in the field as a whole or people who were influences on me?
Let's do both, but let's do the first one first.
Okay.
Field as a whole.
The field as a whole, I think there's certainly Johan Galtung in terms of being a father of the field of peace research. Bolding himself, for me, Bolding is the key figure. Other people like Gene Sharp, who would not regard himself as a peace researcher, in fact, actively says he's not a peace researcher. But I regard him as one of the fathers of the field of peace research for his work on nonviolent struggle. But then there's the other side. I mean, you go back to people like Richardson and Wright and the quantitative stream there in the international relations end of peace research. In conflict resolution, people like Roger Fisher, certainly John Burton, and again, John crossed, I think, peace research and conflict resolution in IR, but primarily became a founder of the field of conflict resolution as a separate field.
Yeah, okay.
All those guys at the program of negotiation at Harvard, obviously beginning with Roger Fisher, and then the other people at Harvard who weren't in the program of negotiation, like Herb Kelman, the whole series of RAFA and all the other program of negotiation, both out of business approaches and law approaches.
What do you think these guys, and they were all guys that you mentioned?
They were all guys.
What do you think?
They're practically all still guys.
What do you think these guys had in mind as the vision for what they were trying to do? What do you think they were really trying to build at that point?
I think that's different for some of them. I think certainly for the early ones who were at Stanford together in that group that eventually migrated to Michigan.
Yeah.
Bolding, Rappaport, Kelman, and then adding Singer and so forth. I think they wanted to combine this new behavioral approach that had appeared in the social sciences and use it to transform public policy and the world to be a more peaceful world by an understanding of conflict. Yeah, and I guess that would be true if you took the others at CIPRI and PRIO and the other places in Europe that had the more research oriented kind of approach. I think that would be the sort of the original vision for all of them.
So it wasn't a vision to set up a new field or a new discipline or anything like that?
I think that was part of it. Yeah, I'm not sure whether it was a discipline, because there's a lot of stuff about interdisciplinary work, and I mean, Boulding certainly was beyond discipline. He, started out as an economist and ended up as everything from an ecologist to a philosopher. But Kelman was always a psychologist. Singer was always a political scientist. Alger was always a political scientist. They didn't leave their fields to form a new field. They worked with others in other fields and incorporated some of that stuff to be a new field, but definitely not a new discipline, I don't think. And I think back when I came into the field in the 60s and 70s, people were beginning to set up programs, but they were interdisciplinary programs. They were not separate disciplinary-based programs where people identified as conflict researchers or peace researchers. They were political scientists doing peace research or doing conflict research. They were psychologists doing conflict research. And all of the early programs that I can think of, whether they were research programs like the Program of Negotiation, or whether they were teaching programs like Peace and World Order Studies at Colgate, where I was, were all interdisciplinary. And I still think that is significant. I don't want it to become a discipline.
Okay. All right. How about you? Who were influences on your thinking and your work? Chad, you've mentioned. Who else?
Chad was important in the sort of traditional international relations version of it. And he also introduced me. He brought through the graduate courses people like Johan, people like Yoshi Sakamoto and Musha Koji, and Japanese peace researchers who were very much part of the World Order Models project that Saul Mendowitz and Richard Falk started. That was a big influence on me early on. The World Order Models project funded some of my very early research on alternative security methods. Let's see, who else? Okay, so there was that element, the sort of world order approach. Johan was important to the field. I didn't really get to know much about his research until later on. So in that he was an influence on the field, he was an influence on me, but not a personal influence until many years later.
Not directly, okay.
When I went to Colgate, I became conscious of the conflict resolution field and the nonviolence field. Ted Herman sort of systematically took me by the hand and said, "Hi, you're going to become director of Peace and World Order Studies, so we better teach you Peace and World Order Studies." And Gene Sharp was brought into the introductory classes that we were teaching. And that's where I learned about Sharp's work on pragmatic nonviolence. He subsequently became an extremely important figure to me. So that if I had to say that the three influences beyond the Chad Alger, David Singer period, after which I totally rejected quantitative research, after that period, it would clearly be Kenneth Boulding, Gene Sharp, John Burton, Herbert Kelman.
Okay.
With Kenneth and Gene being the most important people.
Where was Gene around at this time?
Gene was he was heading the Program on Nonviolent Sanctions in Conflict and Defense at the Center for International Affairs at Harvard.
Ah, okay.
He was still head of that
there.
at that point.
Okay.
That was before the Einstein Institution was set up.
Okay.
So.
And Lou?
Lou Kreisberg?
Yeah.
Lou Kreisberg became an important figure to me later on. I knew of his name, again, through Ted Herman while I was at Colgate. And I invited him as one of the speakers for that first COPRED conference I ran. I went to COPRED for the first time after I was already at Colgate. Chad had been going for years and never even told me it existed. Ted took me to COPRED, and I met Lou Kreisberg in that context, and being an hour down the road at Syracuse, I got to know him and his work, and that of other conflict people at Syracuse. So he came to that first alternative security meeting that I did at Colgate. And he subsequently became important because he was working in the field of NGOs, like Chad was. Some of his early work was on social movements and non-governmental organizations, and I was very much interested in that, again, through Chad and increasingly through Lou. And then Lou subsequently became important to me in terms of the introduction to the whole field of conflict studies as a field, which I wasn't aware of as a comprehensive field. I had the conflict resolution. And he introduced me to a lot of the theoretical work in conflict studies. So, you know, I mean, I'd been aware of Koser and Simmel and you know, Dahrendorf and so forth, because my ex-husband had been a sociologist, so I had known some of that stuff. But systematic work on that I got from Lou's textbook and then from conversations with Lou, because he was an hour down the road.
Yeah.
So, and then increasingly over the years, he became more significant as our work began to converge on that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now you mentioned CoPred, and you've mentioned people, individuals coming to the program at Colgate. What were other ways in which you became aware of the extent of these three overlapping disciplines? Lou was important to introduce you to
Conflict
the whole
studies
conflict
as a whole.
studies
Yeah.
thing, but
Yeah.
how else did you get yourself sort of integrated into what was going on?
IPRA was important. International Peace Research Association was important. Again, Ted sort of systematically took a junior faculty member to every meeting he could go, take me to. And so both IPRA and CoPred were important in that. Individual sort of research meetings in different places. I was sort of peripherally included in some of the World Order Models Project stuff, and so became aware of Johan and Saul and Dick Falk and all, that whole bunch of people,
Right,
and a widely international group. I mean, Latin Americans and Africans and so forth and so on. Ali Mazrui and people like that.
Yeah, okay.
But I was always very marginal in that. Women were always very marginal in that group, tremendously marginal. And I was never, though they did fund some of my work, I was never a regular member of WOMP. Later on, after I became director of peace studies, by that time I think I was known for working in helping to set up and develop peace studies programs. And so I got invited to a lot of places to help them set up peace studies programs.
Okay.
And in terms of helping them to set up stuff, I was exposed to entirely different visions of what they were trying to do. So there were those who came out of political science departments, there were those who came out of philosophy departments, those who came out of the hard sciences where they'd gotten concerned with arms control and so on. And it gave me a different version of the field than I was getting in the standard peace research kind of organizations. And later on, there were the various conflict resolution groups, the National Institute of Peacemaking and Conflict Resolution, and various groups like that. I did those sort of occasionally, but they never became primary to me. Harvard was really important. I had an appointment at Radcliffe there for a couple of years and was part of the program on negotiation on the one hand, and I was part of the Center for International Affairs and the Nonviolent Sanctions Program. I got to know Herb there. Herb then introduced me to John Burton when he came to speak. And so it was, involvement in one program after another would lead me to individuals who would then lead me to other programs.
Okay.
And, the other thing that I forgot, at some point while I was at Colgate, I also got asked by Charles Chatfield, historian from Wittenberg University, to become co-editor of the journal Peace and Change, which was Copered's journal, but it was also the journal of what was then called the Conference on Peace Research and History. And so I got to know Dave Patterson, I got to know Larry Whitner. I worked very closely with Charles Chatfield on the editing work for several years. So he was important in introducing me to the whole group of historians. Most of whom were involved in research on peace movements and on arms control and disarmament. So that was another whole area. It's not an area that I've done any research on until recently, but they were also a significant influence.
Yeah, and some way out in left field, I think, as well, from the sort of mainstream.
Oh yeah,
as well.
absolutely, a totally separate group. You know, those guys and Sandy Cooper, most of them didn't know and don't know either the conflict resolution people or the peace research the other peace research people, and still don't. I mean, they aren't even slightly interested in the field of conflict resolution research.
How come? What?
Different vision of how you make change. Certainly history is very different as a discipline from the standard social sciences, and I mean jealously regards its way of doing research as appropriate, and the sort of empirical behavioral revolution that went on in the social sciences as being absolutely invalid. So some of it was methodology, and I don't know beyond that.
But it is interesting because looked at from the other point of view, towards these guys, there's a considerable amount of doubt as to whether they're actually part of the field at all.
Oh yeah, I think that's true.
You know, so it's a sort of a mutual lack of attraction almost.
Yeah. But see, I think that's still true even within the increasingly integrated fields of peace studies, peace research, and conflict studies, conflict resolution research. I don't think those are integrated to the degree that some other people probably think they're integrated.
Okay. Okay, let's move on a bit and think about the field as it is now, if it is a field, because it seems to me anyway that in recent years it's become very subdivided and very sort of split into subcategories in recent years. You know, we talk about, you know, for example, peacekeeping or peacemaking or peace building. We make distinctions between settlement, resolution, transformation, etc., etc. Do you think this is something which the early people envisaged was going to happen, or do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's something which ought to be encouraged, ought to be stopped? What do you think about the way things have been going, to me, for the last 10, 15 years?
Most of the terms that you just mentioned are terms that would be familiar to people in the area of conflict resolution. Some of them, peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building, would be familiar to people in international studies generally, and familiar to people in peace research. But the debates over conflict management versus conflict resolution, and then going on to conflict transformation, I think still are not predominant in peace research, and certainly not in international relations. They are within the field of conflict research and conflict resolution research. The things like peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building, I was just teaching this the other day, that the original version of that in the 1992 Agenda for Peace that Boutros Ghali did was preventive diplomacy, peacemaking, and peacekeeping. And peace building was only an afterthought, and it was phrased as post-conflict peace building. And today, we almost say it as one word: peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building. That transformation itself, I think, has been important, and the fact that we leave out the word prevention. And I think we do often leave out the word prevention. I think is significant. I think that for the very early founders, the Richardsons and the Wrights, and then the Center for Conflict Resolution at Michigan people, they had that comprehensiveness in terms of vision, in terms of different phases of conflict, different disciplines. I don't think they would have envisioned any of those terms becoming technical terms to the degree to which they've become in the field of conflict resolution. I think they were more interested in employing the social science empirical techniques to look at the structure of the system rather than some of the more methods-oriented approach. I mean, all of those things that you mentioned, okay, conflict transformation is broader than method, but a lot of even that is sort of method-oriented. How do you frame something? How do you, all of that kind of stuff.
Sort of pragmatic.
Pragmatic
how do you
and
do it?
practical, yeah. And I don't see that in the early founders of the field. I see the breadth all across conflict, from individual conflict to international.
Okay.
But I don't see the individual specialization. What I see sometimes is even fragmentation that has come about in the last 10 or 15 years. And I think some of it's good and some of it's bad. I mean, it's very good that we can now teach kids how to do peer mediation in a playground, okay? And it's good that we can, teach divorce mediation as a regular field in undergraduate and graduate programs. But the other more detail of the terminology, I think the conflict resolution field has gone considerably more pragmatic, and that again is one of the things I think I missed when you were asking me about the differences between the field, has been more pragmatic than the field of peace research, which is still much more theoretically oriented and basic research oriented. Now, conflict studies incorporates both of those, but conflict resolution has gone much more pragmatic. And I mean, you've got stuff that's gone into the UN. I mean, if I go back to my original interests, I mean, now you have a peace building commission in the UN. Wouldn't have suited the founders of the field because the peace building commission in the UN is under the Security Council. Now, and that certainly was not the original vision, to make peace under security and under the 5 major powers. But yet the fact that there is a recognition of that term peace building and the institutionalization of that has been important.
Do you think that peace studies has sort of had a parallel, well, let's call it a division of labor rather than fragmentation? Or is there still an element?
Or specialization.
Well, okay, specialization, yeah. Do you think the same thing has happened in peace studies, or is it much more integrated than conflict?
No, I think it is as equally specialized, or in some ways rather than specialized, non-integrated. It was intended to be integrated. And there are those in the field who are integrated across disciplines and across levels and across approaches and across, whatever. But you still have a different kind of peace research being done in philosophy than you have in political science, and that's different from what's in sociology. I mean, the people that I know in sociology who do social movements do different kinds of social movement work than a lot of the political scientists do even. So no, I think there is the same kind of specialization, some of it across disciplinary lines, some of it across levels of analysis, and some of it across methodologies, some of it across ideologies in that field as well.
Okay. We've always talked about this field as being multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary, and the fact that it's borrowed from all sorts of other areas and fields of study. So what were some of the crucial ideas that came into the field that you think were very, very important and very influential?
You might say that at the beginning period, that there were borrowings, but I think as you get later on, there are not just borrowings from disciplines, but there are cross-fertilizations across the fields that are developing, the new interdisciplinary fields, which are developing their own identities, and the other fields. So, I don't know, if you take early stuff like Sharif's work on superordinate goals and so on, that comes into conflict resolution, becomes important, never gets to peace research.
Really?
Certainly never gets to IR, though I think it gets used by various kinds of diplomats and so on, but isn't very much talked about there. You have all the things from the social movement work and social change work that becomes significant. That becomes more important as it comes into the peace research, conflict resolution nexus, but then it goes back out into sociology and political science in separate ways. So there's this back and forth mixture between disciplines and between these, what I would call fields of peace research and conflict resolution, that goes in several directions. I mean, framing from psychology, and then that gets changed as it comes into the certainly power from my own discipline of political science, from the traditional international relations use of power, power as coercion and so on. Weber's work on legitimacy and power in there, and then how some of that gets transformed by Gene Sharp when he uses a concept of power that is somewhat from sociology, but very close to what Milgram is, when Milgram's talking about obedience, and then Sharp builds on the psychological concept of obedience to transform the concept of power in ways that I think are quite remarkable. And then Bolding has a different approach to power, where he draws, he's got the threefold conceptualization of power, where he's drawing on political military power from the political science people. He's drawing on economic power from the economist, and then he's drawing on integrative power from sociologists, and I think from something that isn't even discipline. I think he draws a lot of that from his Quakerism. I mean, he talks about the power of love. God forbid I should say that in political science. But that kind of interweaving by the people that were interdisciplinary is going back and forth. It's not just borrowing from other disciplines. It's borrowing some things, coming up with some things, transforming it, and sending it back out to the disciplines in different forms. And I mean, Johann again. Johann certainly, while he is a sociologist, he is, I think, distinctly peace research. He talks about himself sometimes now as conflict resolution, but he's not conflict resolution. He's peace research. And his structural violence concept was unique to peace research. It didn't come out of a discipline. It got created by him and then went out to the disciplines.
So do you think that the ideas that have been transformed within the field of peace studies, conflict studies, now this is an interesting idea, because I think you're the first person who's mentioned it, feed back into traditional disciplines and have an impact even on sort of rather conservative ones like international relations, if I am not in...
I think the specialization that has occurred within the fields has also occurred in the disciplines.
Okay.
So, for example, in my own discipline of political science, the Americanists don't generally talk to the international relationists, who may or may not talk to those people in comparative politics who are doing Indian politics, who may or may not talk to those people who are doing European politics. Okay, so you got the same kind of specialization, I think, everywhere. But and now I forget what the basic question was.
Well, it's the question of, feeding back into the
into the
more,
disciplines,
the more
yeah.
traditional
Okay,
disciplines.
and I think that one of the things that's happened as peace studies has developed, as peace research has developed, as conflict resolution research has developed, it has, in some cases, merged back in the disciplines, and that has been both institutional and intellectual.
Okay.
So, for example, when I started out in peace studies, I went to COPRED and I went to IPRA. But I continued going to the International Studies Association, where peace research and conflict research was not yet recognized. Okay? Then we formed the Peace Studies section of ISA.
Okay.
And since that time, many of the people that I used to know from COPRED and IPRA, who no longer go to COPRED and IPRA because they see them as too soft and wishy-washy, now go to the Peace Studies section of ISA. So the old people that I knew in the early days of IPRA, particularly some of the European researchers, one of them has now become president of the International Studies Association this year.
Yeah.
Okay? And those people have even migrated to other sections of ISA, to the security studies section, to the various other parts of ISA. So peace studies and conflict resolution research have influenced the disciplines and the other major conventional interdisciplines like international studies, and have become regularized as part of that, changing them in the process, and in some sense leaving the field, at least the field of peace research, weaker, because it has become, I think, in many ways softer. Okay, people who think, well, there are the people that I call the peace is nice people, some of whom are Quakers like me, but who don't care about research. They think that if everybody would just be nice to each other, then the world would be a good place. Okay?
It'll be a nicer place.
It would be a nicer place, but we would also have peace. Okay, and I happen to buy into the Bolding, Singer, Kelman, Burton. Research is an important part of this. We don't have all the answers. The academic field has something to contribute. Okay, there are a lot of people in the field of peace studies, which I would include the educational side, not just the research side, who think that we have the answers, and if everybody would just adopt them, would be okay. And I think that's a problem with some of the peace studies institutions at this point. Okay. So in terms of it going back into the discipline, each one of these is specializing, but the research people, I think, have mostly gravitated to disciplines, but as they have gravitated to the disciplines and to the more research-oriented interdisciplinary programs, like international studies, they have left the other peace studies organizations weaker.
Okay. Well,
Like I no longer go to COPRED. There is some good stuff going on in COPRED. I went to International Peace Research Association, and there was some very good stuff going on there, but some years it isn't. International Studies Association I go to every year. I think I've never missed that.
okay.
But I go to the parts of that are the peace studies parts and the international organization parts, not the traditional IR stuff. You know what? You make me realize there's something I've totally left out, and that is the influence of feminist studies, which was not important to me as an introductory influence. I was brought up by the generation of male peace researchers.
Okay.
You'll notice I mentioned Kenneth Boulding, but not Elise Boulding. Elise didn't become important to me until much later on. But there were women peace researchers who influenced me early on. Probably the first person that I ever heard about peace studies from was Betty Reardon.
Uh-huh.
And that was before I was even an academic. And I didn't at that time recognize it as a feminist approach, though Betty and I began to do work together later on, and when we were working with UNESCO on gender and a culture of peace and things like that, I began to consciously identify some of my approach as feminist, though I don't bring that into the political science side or the peace research side. I do it separately. Bernice Carroll was another one, through the historian side. I got to know her through the Conference on Peace Research and History and the Peace and Change. She had a conceptualization of power that was distinctly feminist, you know, power with rather than power over, and that was important to me. So there were these other interdisciplinary fields that were developing that were also significant, but I didn't fully integrate them in my thinking. And as I listen to what we've been talking about now, I realize that I didn't even identify those as formative influences.
But
they
were.
were. They absolutely were. Though I was always reluctant to bring my gender research into my peace research.
Now, why do you think that was?
It was not acceptable. Women were not acceptable. Women are still not acceptable. And I think that has to do with the continuing emphasis in our general culture, particularly in American culture, but general culture worldwide, on the idea that force and coercion are fundamental dynamics that you're never going to do away with, and that ultimately power, real power, is based in force and coercion. And that doesn't work for women. We're smaller, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
And so I guess I've always been hesitant to do that. I'm afraid that I will be treated as weak if I bring out the gender side.
But even within the peace studies field?
Absolutely, even within the peace field.
So are there people like you, do you think, are there many of them who are sort of deterred from saying this is an important element, it ought to be in the peace studies, it's not?
For the younger generation, it's quite the opposite of that. For the younger generation of women, particularly in conflict resolution research and conflict studies, they have found it very important to identify themselves as feminist researchers.
Okay.
That's true to a lesser degree in international studies and in peace research.
About that,
I mean, there's a whole group of people that do international critical studies from a feminist perspective.
Yes.
Spike Peterson, Ann Tickner, and so on.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, that's a group of people that I know from. I mean, I also do gender studies and women's caucus international studies, but I know that group of people from an entirely different connection than I do the peace research people.
And there isn't a group like that in peace research or conflict research?
A gender group? If there is, I'm not aware of it, but there may be.
Well, I'm not, but then, you know, being an unregenerate male.
I know those people through international studies, and I know them through some of the programs. Like, I know Syracuse, for example, had a really strong feminist influence, and I got to know some of those people through Lou during the time I was at Colgate and after that. But I know those through the programs. I don't know of a group that does that. The identifiable group of gender-oriented is in the International Studies Association.
Yes.
And some of those are conflict resolution and peace research oriented, and some of them are absolutely not.
Carolyn, you talked a bit about the way in which your own personal road through the field had actually been affected by conferences that you went to and contacts that you made, but more generally within the field, what do you think were important contact points or areas where people could come together and meet and exchange ideas? What helped to push the field towards being more integrated?
Certainly the conferences I mentioned, IPRA, COPRED, and then, again, for me, not so important, but within the conflict resolution field, you must have, all that series of interdisciplinary, more method-oriented kinds of things, from NCPCR through the all, specialized conferences of various sorts, short, small research meetings. Journals certainly were important. I mean, if you go way back to the foundation of the Journal of Conflict Resolution back in, I think it was 57, that became significant. Journal of Peace Research later on, and Peace and Change. Peace and Change became an important vehicle.
But you said that was very much run, originally at least, by historians.
Yeah, but by the time I came into it, and the reason that I was asked to become a co-editor was that Charles Chatfield was on the history side and I was on the social science side.
Oh, okay.
So the goal of that at that point was to integrate COPRED and CPRH, and to make the journal a more interdisciplinary journal. And we succeeded in doing that for a while. Then it went back for a while to be primarily history, and it's gone back and forth between being social science and history, and between sort of an intellectual identity and ownership by those different fields. There have been lots of other kinds of institutions that have been important, like the foundation of the group that spread across all the California universities. That became important, and I was in San Diego during the time of that. So that was important. And the other various regional consortia, though that one actually had money behind it for a while. The other thing that was of major significance was the foundations that entered the field. Certainly Hewlett is the most important influence, I think, the whole field of conflict resolution. I mean, without Hewlett, you wouldn't have gotten the original programs. I was at the program at negotiation at Harvard when Hewlett did their first money. Then when I went to Hawaii, we were one of the first 3 programs funded by Hewlett that next year, and had money for 15 years. That our program would have died without that outside money. And there were like 18 programs that owe their life, some of which have died, but some of which have been successful. And they were important in integrating that practical side, funding some of the pragmatic organizations, as well as insisting on a research base and introducing it into academia. So I think Hewlett was of tremendous importance. USIP, U.S. Institute of Peace, after they got founded in the mid-'80s also, and MacArthur Foundation. MacArthur did some of my research, USIP founded some of my research early on in alternative security systems and some of the institutional stuff, and I think they were important across the field.
All right, let's take another tack. I think one of the characteristics of the field, whether it's peace studies or conflict studies, either of those two things, is that it's always attempted to be practical and applied, the ideas to be taken into the real world and used to deal with conflicts or to create peace. How successful do you think we've been?
I think I'd have to separate the fields to answer that, because I think there's a different answer for them. I think conflict resolution, and I mean that more narrowly than conflict studies, I think conflict resolution has been fairly successful at a number of levels in influencing peace, security, conflict, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
At the very lowest level, certainly the stuff like playground mediation and projects like the Children's Creative Response to Conflict project that has been adopted in the New York City school system even. That's
Okay.
pretty big success. And the reason that that kind of thing has happened is not because people are interested in international peace. They're interested in, how do kids behave in a classroom? Okay, how can they avoid fights on the playground? So you've got that level, and then the community level, what we call in Hawaii the pigs in the backyard problem, and
The
juvenile.
the barking dog problem.
The barking dog problem.
In Syracuse. Yeah.
Okay. And juvenile restitution has, I think, transformed some of the criminal justice system. And I mean, all the kind of work that Jim Lowy did with community disputes had a real life effect on, the institutionalization in the federal government and in lots of federal agencies. The fact that there are ombudsmen now in programs all through government and private agencies and so on. And I think in the international area, while it's somewhat less so, I think it's been important there. I mean, I already mentioned the creation of the Peace Building Commission. You might regard that as a success. Many people regard it as a failure because it wasn't independent and, separate from the Security Council and so on. But I think the fact that it exists is an important change in the way the UN deals with peace and security matters. The increased use of SRSGs, of special representatives as Secretary General. I mean, there are lots of those now, and that is certainly to some degree due to this same phenomenon of the recognition that there are techniques and ways of thinking about conflict that are different. So with respect to conflict resolution, though I think it is more the methods than it is the overall approach of bringing a more just peace about, I think that has been important in the practical sense at all levels, from the individual level to the domestic group level, community level, all the way up through the international. Peace research, though, I think again has a bigger goal. It has a goal of transforming the structure of the system, and maybe that wasn't the case when Richardson and Wright started out. That was more like, let's get rid of war and mass violence. But by the time Bolding came into it, and even though he is known for the negative peace approach, if you read Bolding, you'll find out he says you cannot have peace without justice, even if what you're looking for is only peace. And certainly Johann's approach is even broader than that. It's justice is the central point, and peace and so on. So no, I don't think we've been successful in bringing about peace with justice. I think we have an exploitative system. I think we have a system that continues to rely on force and coercion as a primary method. We have a United States that has a budget now that is so far dominated by military spending that it is beyond belief. And it's not just the United States, it's a lot of the countries in the world. I think there has been a total lack of success in influencing the actual system with respect to those fundamental ways of thinking about peace and justice and their international relationship. In a smaller way, yeah, we do research now on oppression and exploitation, and there are certainly some governments around the world that have taken that into account. Yes, we've created the U.S. Institute of Peace, and it's doing some important research. There for a while, we created the ANU at Australian, the Peace Research Center there, and then it died. We created the Canadian Institute, and then it died. We created a number of Eastern European institutes, and they died. So there hasn't been success even in institutionalizing this at the national state level, let alone influencing the broader system. Some of them have survived, some of them have been successful, and some of them haven't. But in transforming the underlying paradigm of the relationship between peace and power and justice, no, I don't think we've gotten there. And yet I still kind of hold on to Bolding's first law: if it exists, it's possible. But we ain't there yet.
Well, it sounds to me as though if I were to ask you whether you think that the field has actually fallen short of some of its original hopes and dreams, the answer is that you would give me is yes, it definitely has.
It's fallen short, but it hasn't been totally unsuccessful. Many of those early people, I mean, if we take the people at Michigan, for example, or the people in many of the Scandinavian research institutes who had a parallel but more research-oriented approach all the way along, they were pretty pragmatic people. They were pretty much aware of the existence of political power and what they were coming up against. So they may have been short of the dreams, but they may not have been short of the realistic hopes of some of these people.
So,
I mean, certainly it has influenced the system to recognize peace and justice as legitimate goals in a way that probably wouldn't have been done without that continued persistence on the part of both fields.
okay, well that's not a small achievement.
Yeah, no, I think it's been important.
So, where do you think the field is now? I mean, we've talked about the influence or lack of influence or partial influence on the world out there, but what about the internal world of peace studies and conflict research? And is it healthy? Is it unhealthy? Is it about the same as it was 15 years ago?
No, it's very different than it was 15 years ago.
In what ways?
Again, I think there are different parts of the field that are healthy and unhealthy. Certainly conflict resolution has become more successful, I think, intellectually, pragmatically in terms of its influence on local, federal, international practice, and in institutionalization. Than has peace research.
Okay.
But peace research has a more daunting task. You know, governments and others in power are delighted to reduce the amount of violence and the amount of peace, especially from those who challenge them. Peace research, on the other hand, wants to challenge the fundamental power basis of coercive governmental power. And that's never going to be accepted by those who it is challenging. And, I mean, in a sense, forever in the future, you're going to have that recreation of a radical social change orientation, because anytime you institutionalize something, there's going to be the attempt at co-opting it to those who are in power. I think that's what happened with the field of international relations. It started as a challenge to, you know, coercive diplomacy and behind-the-scenes secret agreements and so on, and then it became mainstream. And then peace research got created and has done the same thing. When there was a lot of money in peace research in the 1980s and early 1990s, all the security studies people came over and said, we're peace researchers too. Now, And then when the money went out, they went back to security studies again. So anytime you have money and institutionalization and jobs and journals and so on, there's going to be an attempt to co-opt it and use it for the purposes of conventional power. And therefore, it may not be that peace research continues as it is. It may be that something else gets formed that we don't know what it is yet that will continue that interdisciplinary nature that is, I think, uninstitutionalizable. Okay, I think once you institutionalize something, there is the risk of it becoming establishment and co-opted and, go back to railroad regulation or whatever back in the, days of the railroad barons. And that therefore it has to be somewhat non-institutionalized in order to have the radical social change part that I think is significant in it. Okay, so where is it now? How is it? Is it different? Successful. Certainly, conflict resolution is successful, but more in terms of methods of making conventional negative peace than I think it has been on making justice. Peace research less successful because it has a bigger goal that is maybe never fully possible, but which has been changing things gradually over time in ways that I think are important.
What direction do you think the field is going to take now? Let's think about the future.
I think there is still the attempt to link conflict studies, conflict resolution studies, and peace research into a tighter field and, for some people, a discipline. And I think there are some places that are going to continue to try to do that. I don't think that's going to become the norm.
Okay.
As I look at the development of programs, teaching programs, and I in the peace studies article I did, I looked at the development of programs as well. The programs are not developing at the Harvards and the Oxfords and the biggest, most powerful, intellectually successful universities. The programs are developing at the community college level. And while that will be extremely important in educating a whole new generation toward alternative ways of looking at peace and security, alternative paradigms, alternative methods, it doesn't seem to have grasped the intellectual center of any of the either individual disciplines or of universities as a whole. I suspect that's going to continue. I don't think it's going to get there at the Harvards and the Oxfords of the world. Though it is there in the interstices of those. I mean, the program of negotiation is at Harvard. Gene Sharp was at Harvard for a while until that program died. Adam Roberts is at Oxford, and so on.
A lot of the programs didn't die. A lot of them were killed.
A lot of them were killed, yeah. And that's been true. It was true in Australia. It was true in Canada. It was true in Copenhagen Peace Research Institute, and so on. Yeah.